We're on.
Hello, and welcome to EQ in the Workplace, the good, the bad, and the reality. As many of you know, I'm Cindy Gay from the Metiss Group. Even if I don't normally sound like myself, John refers to this as my barroom voice because it's allergy season in North Carolina. And John gave business and marital partner, and we're here to take you on a little tour about EQ in the workplace. For all intents and purposes, and for our discussion today, you should know that when we talk about EQ, we're using it interchangeably with emotional intelligence. So that should be kind of the context of today.
So I wonder at what point all this artificial intelligence, as it's called, AI, is going to eventually go to AQ. But it's kind of funny how emotional intelligence has evolved into an EQ identifier, not necessarily EI, how it started.
So a couple of housekeeping items. Rest assured, anyone who has registered for today's webinar will be receiving a recording of this, hopefully by the end of today, tomorrow at the latest. And if you have any questions or thoughts, John will be manning or personing the chat, so you can feel free to put that in there. And there was a third item.
This is a relative. This is what, the fourth or fifth webinar that we've done lately, and what the feedback that we're getting is people really like the fact that we kind of keep it tight, around a half hour. I would expect that to be the case here. It's not going to be long and drawn out, even though we allocate an hour. We'd like to keep it a little bit shorter and
closer to 30 or 40 minutes, depending on the questions or the comments. One thing to please be patient with us today. We have no clue if we're having issues with Demio or internet, or we've changed, as we were preparing for today, we've changed our browser a couple of times, but we were having some problems in some lagging of the pictures, in the slides changing. If that becomes an issue, we'll probably turn off our cameras to see if that helps with some of the streaming, but please bear with us. Hopefully we'll get through today unscathed.
I think it's all the gremlins in the internet wanting to test our EQ. That's what we get.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is, right? All right. So a little bit about the Metiss Group. Of course, you know, I founded the business some time ago in Metro Detroit and expanded here to Charlotte, North Carolina. So we do have several of our team members, maybe half of our team members in Metro Detroit still. Several of us are here in Charlotte, North Carolina. One is stranded out in Florida, and we're looking to add an additional senior advisor to the team shortly. So we're continuing to grow. As many of you know, we really focus in three areas. As behavior experts at work, we like to bring processes around the people part of the workplace to give you a little bit more predictability, because gosh knows this is getting crazy out there. So we like to focus on selection, making sure we're getting the right people in the right seats. Development or performance acceleration. If we've got the right people in the right seats, how do we get superstar performance out of them? And then of course, around some culture or organizational health. Do we really have the culture we need and want to survive and thrive in the future?
And you know what's interesting about EQ is it hits in all three aspects of our practice. And we really think it's important as you're evaluating candidates to get a feel for what their emotional capabilities are, emotional intelligence abilities are. And certainly when you're developing either leaders or individual contributors, EQ is a huge part of that development and that focus. And we all know organizations whose culture isn't focused on EQ is not necessarily going to be an attractor organization or are going to have retention issues. Mm-hmm. So EQ hits in all three areas of talent.
It's true. And ironically, last week I just ran into somebody who was explaining to me that he's got a little over 100 employees, and every single employee who is brought onto the organization on day one goes through an EQ assessment and 3 months of coaching on EQ as they're being inculcated into their culture. So I think it's pretty amazing to see where it's come through the years. So, you know, as we were going through this, a lot of times when EQ has been talked about in the past, it seemed kind of warm and fuzzy and one of those huggy situations, but it's really got a place in the workplace. And as I think back on there's, of course, as a recovering HR person, you can imagine all of the crazy, lousy EQ situations I've encountered. But when John and I first met, we worked at a very large organization that was publicly traded. And I remember one senior VP in particular who, honestly, I mean, every time I was reading all these books on EQ, he was the poster child for all the really bad stuff. We'll just call him Sam. And, you know, of course, I would get the complaints. And one time Darlene came to me and she was in tears, and Sam was overly aggressive and told him that he had heard from the CEO that this was on a Thursday, that they had to get these numbers done for a huge client that we had by Friday morning. It couldn't wait until Monday. It had to be done Friday, and she was going to have to work through the night. And she tried to explain it was her 10th anniversary. They had these dinner plans and these tickets. They've been looking forward to this for months. And he's cutting her off and saying, I don't care about your plans. I told you I needed to have this done. I'm the boss. You need to get it done. And she's trying to explain. She starts saying, but no buts. This is what I said. This is how it's got to be, and so on. And he was way past assertive and into aggressive. So what was interesting is there was a similar situation with our CFO. We'll call him Rich. Nicest guy on earth, very firm, very high standards, right, John?
Yeah.
And everybody wanted to please Rich because he was so brilliant and such a great guy. And he had a similar situation with his assistant. And I remember walking by her desk. I was there late one day and I said, what's going on? And she said, oh, Rich really needs to get this stuff done. And I said, I thought you had plans tonight. Oh, you know what? I don't want to let him down. I know this is a big deal. He asked me if I wouldn't mind staying. I told him about my other plans. He's giving me his credit card to take my girlfriends out to dinner on his credit card on another night to try to make up for it. And, you know, it's still, the work had to get done, but the way he approached it was completely different. And so one of the things that we like in thinking about EQ is not only having some empathy and understanding where other people are coming from, but understanding the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness and how you can apply yourself. In Darlene's situation with Sam, she could have just as easily bumped up her assertiveness a little bit and offered some other suggestions if she could have done some problem solving better, which is also something that's related to EQ. And if she could have been assertive instead of whiny, that might have had a different response from him. And so EQ is really surrounding the whole situation. And the more we can all elevate our EQ, the better off and more effective, more successful we're going to be in the workplace.
And the better you're going to retain your team, the better culture you're going to have. It's not just about getting the work done; it's how the work gets done. And the EQ that is demonstrated within those work groups makes for a better work environment.
So, what is EQ? Of course, we have to understand that some of it is about understanding ourselves, our self-awareness, our self-regulation, as well as understanding others and empathy and communication. This impacts our personal lives, it impacts our professional lives. You know, there's so many different examples of this. I had a brother who was absolutely brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant. He reinvented himself 3 times in 3 disparate careers. He was an electronics engineer, he was a computer programmer, and a surgical nurse. But he had the personality of an enraged porcupine. Just, you know, and when he wanted to be a nurse, I said, are you kidding me? You can't be with humans. He's like, they're going to be sedated. I don't have to deal with them while they're awake. So he understood himself a little bit, but his willingness to understand or have empathy and have that impact his communication towards others was completely absent. So it's not just enough to understand ourselves, but it's also about understanding others. And if we understand others, but we don't understand ourselves and how we're being perceived by others, that's also going to be a problem.
Yeah, but that self-awareness is also needs to be taken to the next level to self-regulation.
True.
So knowing that there are certain times that you may not be well behaved and not regulating that behavior doesn't accomplish anything. And the same on the external part of EQ. Being empathetic and understanding what somebody's going through is one thing, but being able to use that understanding to better communicate with them is really what's important. So understanding yourself without regulation and understanding others without connectivity isn't going to accomplish what you need, and where EQ helps in rounding out both of those areas.
You know, it's a sad example, but I was just talking to someone, the lady who actually cleans our office, or the business that cleans our office, and the owner had a granddaughter who passed away at 2 months from SIDS, and she said that, and I said I was very sorry to hear that. Let us know, put off our cleaning, it's okay. And hoped she and her family would be fine. And she said, we'll be a lot better if people stop saying stupid things like, everything happens for a reason, and your daughter can still have other children. And again, it's people wanting to understand where other people are coming from, but watch what's coming out of your mouths, right? So it's really about communicating, which is impacting relationships, which of course drives our success or lack thereof. If the communication's poor, and the relationships are poor, it's going to impact success in a different way. And there we go. We're having issues. Okay, but it didn't change. Sorry about that, gang. Having some issues again with advancing slides. So what EQ is not, it is not about IQ or intelligence. Actually, they do complement each other pretty well. As someone once said, if you don't have much IQ, it's hard for you to understand situations in which your EQ needs to be raised or adapted. So there needs to be at least a baseline of the IQ. But that EQ, there are plenty of stats and examples these days where the strength of the EQ is actually a greater impact on the business than it is in IQ. It's not about aptitude, not what somebody's skill is. It's not about achievement. It's not about a vocational interest, and it's not about somebody's personality.
One of the things when I look at this, it's all the stuff that's not on a resume.
Yeah.
Because you can look at a resume and you can pick a lot of this stuff up, but you're really not going to be able to tell how well somebody understands themselves or can connect with others by the traditional resume and interviewing techniques. So one of the things that is unique about EQ is it's a relatively new science. I mean, it wasn't until the early 80s when Gardner came out with his 2 books on multiple personality approaches that we really began to pay attention to these soft skills that we have and that we bring into the workplace. And it started to evolve a little bit through the 80s and 90s, but in 1995 is really when it began to raise a lot of awareness within the business world when Goldman brought out this book on emotional intelligence and started talking about it in terms of oneself and understanding and regulation, and then understanding others and feeling empathy towards them. And his model then got brought into the workplace in a lot of different areas. And it was based on that work that other thought leaders and other social scientists started to develop other types of EQ instruments. Now, one of the toughest things that can be developed is some way of determining one's emotional intelligence. Because if you give somebody a questionnaire to fill out and they don't have a lot of self-awareness, how good is that questionnaire going to be? So it's really not an easy way for somebody to self-report how well they are understanding of EQ. There have been some other tools that have come on the scenes. We're going to talk a little bit about one in a little bit, but it is evolving. I think it's going to get a little bit better as some of these AI approaches start to work their way into some of these assessments, but it is a very, very difficult way, very, very difficult to measure one's strength because it's generally self-reported.
I think, it just struck me as I look at this timeline too, when you think back on the 80s and the difference in the labor market then, there were probably 5 humans for every job. It's probably the reverse of that right now. And so, you have bosses saying, you should be lucky you have a job, do whatever I ask. And there wasn't really a quote need for a lot of EQ. And as the labor market started changing, as the internet started getting bigger, the ability to communicate, certainly now with social media, everything we say and do, there can be snippets out there where we lose the context of things. Somebody can take things out of context or within context and still not like what was said. So the importance of EQ has certainly grown. So the fact that this was really only bubbling up in the early 80s, 90s is when it really came into its own, makes a little sense to me as to how we've grown as a society. So why is EQ important in the workplace? One of the things, John and I have been looking for quite some time for a really good EQ tool. And we liked Goleman's work. We like several other social scientists we've been following, and we love their work. But quite frankly, many of the tools out there are really, really poor. To John's point, many of them are just looking at the whether somebody thinks they have good emotional intelligence or not, and measured on a pretty thin scale. What we like when we look at emotional intelligence and how it's hitting the workplace, because we're behavior experts at work, so we're looking at things from how it's impacting the workplace. We really started looking at certainly communication and conflict resolution and adaptability, but decision making, how it impacts our decision making, how it impacts leadership, not followership for that matter, but in the workplace is becoming far more critical because it's impacting so many different aspects of our work.
Yeah, what's really neat about this science is as we're starting to understand the science a little bit more, and we're starting to see what happens when people can develop in some of their EQ areas, there are specific areas in the workplace where we're seeing improvements. And it is around communication and making better decisions and handling some of the difficult interactions better and becoming a better leader in one of the situations Cindy described earlier. And what's becoming huge now is one's ability to accept change and to adapt with some of these new technologies that are coming into the workplace. So what's really good about our ability to develop an EQ is to attack specific areas that somebody might need some work in development in the workplace.
So why is EQ important now in the workplace? And are your slides changing?
Yeah, I got mine.
Okay. You can't deny it. There's heightened sensitivity about everything. Of course, the media and the social media is only trying to make that a more pronounced sensitivity, creating camps of us versus them. That's a big deal. Working from home or working remotely, even in a hybrid situation, more so if you're working remotely, it's in the old days when we all worked together, whether you liked somebody or not, and you knew you were going to have to go spend 8 hours or more with them in the workplace, you had to figure out how to get along. Find something you can talk to this person about. And now, you know what? I only have to put up with them for about an hour on a Zoom call, and I only have to put up with this much of them, so I can just ignore them otherwise. And they can continue to annoy me, and then I can text my buddies about how frustrated I was or whatever. And there isn't that much effort going into it. And I'm wondering if it's, and there isn't anything behind this, but I wonder if EQ is like anything else. Is it not practice? Is it like another muscle that's going to atrophy? And so I think the more we have people working remotely and not wanting to or having to care about getting along with others, we have that challenge going on. I think also, obviously, the speed with which we need to make healthy decisions is huge, and it'd be silly to think that there isn't a significant impact on society. But just in general, I just feel that there's a a real need to understand how EQ is impacting decisions that we make, from impulse control to taking into consideration impact on others, impact on ourselves. We see, and John and I are constantly talking to business owners who feel like they're walking on eggshells all the time. And, there's tons of employees who are rolling their eyes thinking, I can't believe my boss just said X. Probably some of our employees have thought that every once in a while. So,
yeah, it's with some of the social media that's being used today as a communication channel, and in the way in which the messaging can get diluted without having an empathetic understanding of the audience you're trying to reach. The huge focus that organizations are having now on giving back to the community or making society a little bit better, and keep looking out for others and being sensitive to everybody's beliefs. Those are really challenges those are challenges we haven't seen in the past, and being able to empathetically connect to somebody who may have a differing view than most people in society, or certainly you, is a challenge that we're facing more and more today, as more of those views are being demonstrated in the workplace.
just think about, when you think about the impact on society, remember the first major oil spill that they had down in the Gulf, and the talking head that came out from the company, and nobody, the guy's EQ was like, but I remember he came up to the microphone and said, look, nobody's happy that we have to be here today. I was supposed to be on a yacht someplace on vacation, and now I got to be here in front of you guys. So nothing this guy said after that was well received. But that's literally how he started off his presentation, and completely different than when the next oil spill happened. So EQ can be developed, hooray. There's hope. There's different things that can be done relative to self-awareness, empathy, the ability to listen to others, but managing stress, and again, that decision-making, understanding balanced decision-making is going to be important relative to EQ.
Yeah, probably the most important starting point in any kind of development, whether it's EQ or other types of leadership skills, is understanding where you're at now, that self-awareness, and being honest with yourself, and recognizing your strengths and areas that you can be improving on. And that's really the foundation of any developmental approach. And whether you develop that self-awareness through some sort of assessment, or some sort of peer feedback, or through some self-reflection, however you get that is important before you can begin any kind of development journey, particularly in the EQ world. But the cases that we shy away from most are those employees who are demonstrating no humility. They think they know it all. They are being sent to be trained because their boss thinks they need to, and they don't think that they have to be developed, that they can understand others, they know who they are, and they're just not aware of how they are angering others, or how their message is being received. So that self-awareness piece is crucial to however you want to be developed.
So when we look at the piece that excited us most about the model, we'll share with you the model that we've adopted for EQ, and the tool that we've adopted. We really like the way that it looks at decision making as with having 3 legs of the stool, which includes impulse control, reality testing, and problem solving, and that all 3 need to be developed relatively equally, or the stool isn't going to stand, and anything that's on top of the stool is going to fall off. And we get a little bit of leverage, but generally speaking, you want them all 3 really well developed. So John and I, again, were talking about that same company that we worked for, and John was a music buyer at the time, and so was our buddy Wayne. And Wayne and John had a completely different view and of how they approach their work. And we brought in a new president, Pete, and Pete was a bit of an odd bird, but he came in to shake things up. And Wayne was beside himself, just beside himself. This guy's not even from our industry. He's only been here 2 months. He's shaking everything up. He wants us all to learn different things. He's trying to change things before he really understands them. I'm brushing off my resume. I got to find a new, I don't really want to leave this job. I love my job. I need this. I have a monster mortgage. I have all these electronic toys I need to pay for and stuff. But this guy's making me crazy. I'm going to be out of a job. What if he brings in all these new people from the places he used to be, and then I'm out of a job without it. I'm going to find a job before he kicks me out. And he asked John, what do you think? And John's like, I don't know. He's only been here a couple of months, and I talked to the people at the place he used to work, and they really liked him. And I'm learning new things under the sky. My department's been really functioning really well. We've been performing well against goal. I'm learning some new things. I'm not that afraid, but even if something happens and I do go, it's not, I'll land on my feet. They'll have to give me a good package. I've been here for a long time. I'm learning new things under this guy. I'll be able to apply in my next job. It's not the end of the world. So you can see in there, for Wayne, his knee-jerk reaction was to go into fear mode and to start putting a resume out. And his reality testing wasn't there. So John wasn't just pie in the sky. Everything's going to be wonderful. I love our new boss. But he started thinking, even if I do leave, I got to, I'll get a nice package. I've learned some things I can apply elsewhere. I've been performing well. So his reality testing is looking at the pros and cons all the way around. And it allowed him to do some problem solving differently and not to waste a lot of energy in panic and fear mode instead.
Yeah, what we liked about this particular example, so Wayne made the decision to leave the company based simply on the fact that this new guy came in and Wayne was afraid he was going to be targeted and it wasn't going to work out well for him. But he never really bothered to take a look at the situation objectively, and his emotions got in the way of making a rational decision. And we see this in many different ways in the workplace where decisions are made based on emotion, and emotion could be fear, it could be excitement, it could be whatever it is, and there isn't a focus on the underlying facts or what your particular impulse might be skewing your decision to be. So we see this day in and day out, and oftentimes decisions aren't made well because our emotions get in the way.
Yeah, and for me, as I was digging into this particular model, the decision making is really what excited me the most, because we don't think about the maybe impulse control is an easy one to think about, and people make knee-jerk reactions to things, but the reality testing is huge. Again, given heightened sensitivity to things, I think people tend to, we always talk about, we judge ourselves by our intent and we judge others by their behaviors. And so we can jump to conclusions as to why people are behaving this way and what they're trying to do, and not going through reality testing about, well, maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe it was intended to be a little different. And so the reality testing, it to me was a huge piece to consider as an EQ function of decision making and the impulse control, and obviously both have to impact the clarity around the problem solving. So the EQ Edge is the book that really is the foundation for the EQ model that we've adopted. In this model, there are 5 composite scales. Self-perception and self-expression are the ones relative, obviously, to ourselves. The interpersonal skills is how well you're interacting with others. And then, of course, decision-making and stress management. And in the stress management, keep in mind, it's not only stress tolerance that we think of all the time or frequently, but also the ability to be flexible and optimistic. So it doesn't mean that you're pie in the sky things, but that you're confident things are going to work out positively. And that helps you deal with stress a little bit more, as does your flexibility, because if you're too rigid, then you're going to be constantly being put in a position where stress is extraordinary for you.
Yeah, and this is just one example of a lot of different EQ models that are used for development. We like this one because it's relatively simple. There are 5 areas. Within each of those 5 areas, there's 3 different types of skills which are focused in those areas. But it isn't the model that's really going to drive one's development. It's just a commitment to a certain aspect of emotional intelligence and develop within those areas. And however they're uncovered and whatever model is used isn't nearly as important as the self-discovery and the commitment to development afterwards.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that, as I mentioned, John and I had been searching for a really strong EQ assessment for a long time, and there's really a lot of garbage out there. So we're pretty excited about this one, and the fact that it's available as both an individual, self-reported, but it's 133 questions relative to those different areas, and it asks about each of those areas many times, and that if the answers aren't consistent, it calls that out for your coach to explore. So it's a little bit hard. It's not as easy to game. We also love the fact that this EQI has a 360 component to it, so which is incredibly powerful when it comes to growing in individuals' capacity.
So for those who are looking to develop EQ, there are many different ways you can go about it. It all begins with some sort of assessment or some sort of self-discovery, but then to take that understanding and read more and learn more about yourself and how some of those skills can be developed. There's tons of EQ workshops that are available now online as well as in person. And when you get involved in any kind of development, the key is to understand the skills you're going to be focused on, whether it's within the decision-making realm, whether it's on problem solving or impulse control or reality testing. Those are specific EQ skill sets that can be broken down into some learning module or some sort of learning piece, and then built into a much larger curriculum. And then the really important thing is once you've understand or found a particular skill that you want to get developed, is to practice it. So if one of the skills that you're going to develop is impulse control, then how are you going to practice that, and what are certain situations where you want to raise that awareness and try and change that particular EQ skill?
The other thing that's really neat in the EQ Edge book, it does give you some practicing things that you can employ if you wanted to work on some of those. Maybe you know you're not great in one of these particular areas even without taking the assessment. You can certainly, within the book, look at different suggestions it makes of things you might want to try to employ and practice on your own to get stronger in those particular areas. So I know it's we're trying to be tight to the half hour on the presentation point. Cool.
Go ahead, feel free to put any questions into the chat box. I did have a couple that came in earlier. The first one is, what is one of the biggest EQ issues you've seen in the workplace, and how have people addressed that?
One of the biggest EQ issues, I think it's really comes down to jumping to conclusions, misunderstanding where somebody else is coming from, and the whole judging thing of others, this judging of others and assuming that they're not as good or as worthy or as fabulous as we are, as we want to be, is what I see as a big issue.
Yeah, and I think it comes out when the intent and the behavior don't necessarily align.
Correct.
So Sam may not have intended to have come down that hard and ruined Darlene's anniversary, but that's what happened, and that was the result of his behavior. So the disconnect between intent and behavior is a part of that self-awareness, part of that self-regulation, understanding what people are thinking, and then delivering the message. So that hits on all 4 areas of that particular EQ, is that one.
I also think it's when one person demonstrates it poorly, it kind of builds on each other. And even using my brother as an example, I mean, he just didn't have great EQ. And there were days he would really get under my skin. And instead of responding with a higher EQ. I distinctly remember saying, Michael, do you have to practice being a jerk, or does this just come naturally to you? And of course, that would prompt a different response from him. And so it just keeps building. And we see that sometimes happening in the workplace, where people who are more passive aggressive will just walk away from somebody else, refuse to work with or do work on a particular project.
I have a couple more questions here. Another one is, how long does it take to develop certain EQ skills?
That's a really good question. I think it's different for everybody. I find that even when I went through my certification, just raising my awareness in certain areas was a giant leap forward. Other folks, if there's a real serious blind spot, it may take longer, and it certainly takes commitment. I mean, you can be aware and you can agree with it and you can say, yes, I'm really bad, but if you have no interest in improving your EQ, it could take you a lifetime.
Well, I think a lot of that comes back to that humility and how receptive you are to some of the challenges you have, and then working on them. And the quicker you can come to grips with that, I think the quicker you can apply some of the things that you learn and develop faster. But it's those people, again, that aren't receptive of their individual faults who take the longest to develop.
Right, and you can certainly practice in the home version, the home game, you know, because it's obviously both in the workplace and at home. It's all around us.
Practice on your dog, not your wife.
Yeah.
And then one more question here. Have you seen any kind of, or are there any kind of correlations between your typical personality assessments and EQ? And we're all familiar with 4-dimensional behavioral assessments and other types of things that are common in the workplace. And is there any kind of correlation between that and EQ?
It's a really good question. So whoever asked that, but at this point, they've been trying to see if there's any correlation, and none of the studies show that there's any correlation whatsoever. It doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert, an analytic, a creative. There's absolutely that. Now, some extroverts and some creatives will tell you they're much better, but that's not necessarily the case. So there's no correlation that we can see.
Now, one of the things, now that hasn't stopped the people marketing some of those instruments from suggesting that they can make a huge impact on EQ.
True.
So,
right. So be careful, because every assessment is designed to measure something in particular, and that's what it's validated for. Because it can measure what it's set out to measure. But there are a lot of folks who are using those tools who try to make an inference that it can measure something different. And as I always say, you can't take somebody's temperature with a thermometer and come back and tell them they've got a broken arm, because you can't tell that from a thermometer. So different tools will help measure different things.
Yeah, but in general, a behavioral assessment is not necessarily going to, particularly if it's self-reported, is not going to identify emotional, intelligent skill sets.
No, it's how the emotional intelligence will be acted out.
Right.
So.
All right.
That's it. So, there's our contact information on the board, as well as a QR reader if you want to download some of these slides or see some more things about our EQ services. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be getting you a recording of this presentation and this webinar shortly. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to John or me.
And we had, depending on the feedback here, we've had a lot of people suggest that we come back and we talk a little bit deeper about some of the skill sets in the various sciences. We may end up doing that on the next one, so we'll see.
Yeah, please, if you have any specific interest in going deeper in this model and understanding some of the things that it will be measuring and how that's going to play out in the workplace, or if you want to talk about a completely different topic, please let us know. From a human behavior perspective, what you'd like to hear about next, and keep an eye out in the next week or two then for our next webinar topic. Have a great one.